Our beloved Sandy has been after this talk for some time, and it isn't really a talk because I'm going to pose some questions so I can go running up stage again. But hashtag bioprotection 21. So korero, insights, reflections, progress, perspectives, but if you ever come to my lectures, it's more like a rant. And I was once told by a student, what you said had nothing to relate to your slides. So I've tried to have a few slides to go on with the korero. Now you look, don't worry, I haven't mislaid the slide. I looked at, well, what has the centre done? And, we're talking about the future, but we also should look back to the past to think about how we go as bioprotection in Aotearoa and some of the amazing mahi and research that you've heard about today and where it's gone to and where it's led to. And I thought, well, what about Māori contributions to bioprotection and biosecurity? That's a good start. Travis, ngā mihi did in the opening, since I'm sort of doing a closing, I thought I'd look at where Te Ao Māori and what the Māori contributions to the centre have been. And this happened way before I was involved. And so that was our last talk, I think. Ngā mihi to my collaborators, conspirators, and other people. And acknowledging there's been a lot of people as part of anyone's journey, especially my own. So kia ora, Nick, Jamie, Mel, Amanda, of course, plus even Simon Lambert, who's not here. There's a lot of people that have contributed to our mahi, and here we all are. Plus the students. It's always about the students, and that's the pipeline, but the pipeline are actually real people, he tangata, and you've seen some of their research today, and they've have become brilliant researchers and are going to take bioprotection Aotearoa forward in many other ways. And of course, ngā mihi to Matua and the Kahui Māori, an integral part of our journey as Māori researchers in the biosecurity, bioprotection world. So that was the aims, that was just a little bit of what that korero was about. And 2017, it's 2021, 4 years. And I would contend we're in a different place in space than ever before. And the journey of Aotearoa, New Zealand, Te Tiriti, I used to go to conferences way back in places like Hamilton, and even the treaty wasn't known about. So the way the journeys that we have had together as a nation can be reflected in the science we do and the biosecurity system we work in. And protection of the taonga, papatūānuku, te ao Māori, it's very much integral to what we do. And we had some great korero this morning, and those ecosystems, the taonga, the whenua, the waiawa, what's at threat? So why do you do biosecurity? There's a whole lot of reasons, but it's these ecosystems that we are really trying to really look after in a way that we have to as guardians, kaitiaki, carers, protectors. And I think we're all on this journey together. We do it in agency, like 10 years in Auckland Council, Te Papa Atawai, MPI, the research that you all do brings together a thread that is all about where we go as Aotearoa, New Zealand and beyond. So never lose sight in the biosecurity system of why you're doing it. And plant pathology is my journey through the biosecurity system, but we acknowledge that our taonga, our plants have been at threat for many, many different reasons for many years. And so I'm just going to splice through some of the random slides and sing out if you want to say anything or add anything to these wonderful, wonderful pests that we face in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But the impacts that they have devastated and degraded and depleted and diminished our whakapapa, our heritage, and who we are as a nation, and how we, and especially as Māori, what these tipuna mean to us. So it's huge when you see your tipuna suffering like this. So it's not just the journey of studying a rust pathogen, it's about what it does to us as a people and to our taonga. And I mean, the Cook scuba scurvy grass is a very famous taonga because of what it brought to, the first European that were encountering Māori. There's all sorts of issues and tissues about biosecurity from the start of this nation. And then journey through. Remember Biosecurity New Zealand? Who remembers that? It did exist. I think it's coming back. So we've worked within and with agents, and within agency, I want to acknowledge people working in agencies. There's passionate people throughout the government sector. You heard Mel talk about her new mahi in the Ministry for the Environment. There are real people working in agencies, and although it's easy to contend with working in agencies, and often seen as barriers or impediments, it's agencies like MPI, like Biosecurity New Zealand, that have brought New Zealand one of the best biosecurity systems in the world. And I remember delegations from Taiwan, Hawaii, all over the world coming to see and learn what Biosecurity New Zealand had put in place to protect our taonga. So I don't think there's enough compassion and, I guess, acknowledgement of people working in agencies for their mahi and their blood, sweat and tears. So kia ora to those people. And some of those are still in the labs in Tamaki. But you always have to challenge a system, and you have to challenge the science that underpins it. And so when we talk about biosecurity, risk, response, eradication, long-term management, you do have to think about what you're doing and what values and what, I guess, risks there are to our special ecosystems and our well-being. And I guess that's one of the, there was some korero yesterday about invasive insects. And I will also raise the flag for entomology. So I know there's a lot of entomologists in the room, and so we have to acknowledge it's a science system together, and this is poraporo. It's one of our taonga. It's often known as a weedy little thing at the edge of scrub, but to our people it's a blessing and in all its many forms. And so when the hadder beetle arrived, and ngā mihi to Margaret and Darren up in Tamaki Makaurau, who first raised, well, the hadder beetle does have risk to industry, does have risk to economic solanum, but it also has risk to taonga, and this is a tweet, hashtag, what's he called? Margaret, NZ Hymenoptera, in 2018, and there's the damage of the hadder beetle, which was on our taonga poraporo and hadn't been assessed across the breadth of risk or biosecurity risk to taonga. And so this is where the Indigenous voice and Maori voice, Te Māori, looking at taonga as having those special values as our tipuna and deserving thinking of in a biosecurity system has been a journey in itself, because we never used to, and in the system, we never used to acknowledge that. I mean, the system, we did, but the system didn't. So it's about system change. And I think the locals also like to munch poraporo, but I'd rather see our locals eat the poraporo rather than the hadder. So keeping things out like the hadder beetle is really important, but it's also what you do with it after it arrives. Now, here's a whittle, here's a challenge. We had a few questions in the morning about, and yesterday too. So, my amazing colleague, Albie Marsh, leant over on his phone and said, look, do you know this? And because virology rules the world, this virus has been detected in New Zealand, and being a pathogen of solanum, well, again, that whole story of poraporo comes back. So if you work in biosecurity, you've got a job for life. So, and someone said yesterday, well, what do you do to get engagement, and what do you do to get some urgency into the system when there's, I guess, out of some of that questions, there needs to be hui, but there needs to be dui. And in the biosecurity system, there needs to be a rapid response when things like hadder or whatever arrive, or myrtle rust. So what do you do when you need to engage a whole range of kaitiaki and mana whenua, for example, and others who are working in their daily lives to look after porapora, whether it's te papa atawai? Well, we had, how many years between HADA and PEP MV arriving? So we've often talked about what do you do, and MPI has often said that, what do you do in peacetime? So if you're in an eradication response, and everyone needs to know now, as the text went out to Albie, and that about this virus, but what has happened between HADA and PEP MV around porapora and the risk and threat. So it's what you often do in what we call peacetime. And I know in biosecurity there often isn't, because if you talk to MPI, there's often 20 to 40 responses at any one time. But that's the sort of thinking and the questions that were posed yesterday about barriers or pace or timelines. And in the biosecurity space, it's immediate often. So that's where engaging along the way and forming relationships and partnerships and collaborations and building that sequentially and iterations through the system and through the motu, you have those relationships in place and embedded. And that's where the korero rant te tiriti, or the treaty, and that partnership for a start is a start of how you do that. Because you know who to get on the phone and call, and you can work the kumara vine and the flax roots and the grass roots, and you can get to the people you know if you've built and established trusted relationships and partnerships. So that would be my answer to some of the korero yesterday, is how do you get that sense of urgency, or how do you, there's the paperwork, the bureaucracy, but timelines are important in biosecurity, and the timelines work really fast when you call the kumara vine, and next minute that's all in action. That's saving you a lot of time in the end. So that's my answer to some of that korero yesterday. If you have those relationships, you don't need to necessarily delay anything. Weeds. Weeds. And the reason I like to add in weeds, because my life was 10 years of weeds. But we had a little korero, and I've been really pleased the words social license and cultural license and social science have woven themselves through into this conference. And once upon a time, you'd never heard such the words. In fact, it was like if you said there wasn't such a thing as social and cultural license, let alone social scientists to study it. So we've moved in many ways in the system to see what the failings have been and why, and the answers have come up around why do people fear GMOs? Why do people fear biological control? Why do people fear RNAi? Why do people oppose it, from the politicians through to the community and communities? Now that is because us as a system or a science has moved away from that connectivity, from having that open and frank and honest discussion, kanohe ke te kanohe, looking each other in the eye and talking about what we do. And I think that's a really important journey that, since we had the Royal Commission on Genetic Modification, what really has happened since then to really embed those philosophical stances through Aotearoa New Zealand. And it's been ad hoc, it's been disjointed, it's been here and there, it's raised in various rooms occasionally. I acknowledge the mahi of Genomics Aotearoa to put that out there, but really nothing since. So that would answer a question as to why there is no social license, yet people moan there hasn't been. Well, there hasn't been that engagement, and there certainly hasn't, and I would contend, the research around those values that transdisciplinarity brings in, other knowledge systems, other beliefs, social science and the like, has not been embedded in right from the start from some of these new developments. But we're getting better at it. And that is, again, the dates. The dates matter. So the UN pesticide warning adds risks for New Zealand exports, glyphosate, GFR New Zealand, March 2015. And then we have the Japan market in our Manuka honey shipments, raising it, was it 6 years later? I would contend Aotearoa New Zealand has not had that conversation around the use of herbicides and glyphosate in the environment to the extent. So again, you talk about timelines, but we've had 6 years as a nation to really face up to this raru around glyphosate. So it's no use pitching that society doesn't understand the safe use of glyphosate and its need, and should we or shouldn't we, and should we use biocontrol instead of glyphosate, and are there mātauranga solutions in there that can also be thought about? Well, 6 years and it's just inflaming on. So I think that would be one of my answers to some of the korero again. So it's been, as a nation, we do have to face those issues, because otherwise it'll be another 6 years and glyphosate will be found somewhere else. So we come back to Te Tiriti and the use of herbicides, and I'm looking at the Tipuna Maunga Authority have made it very clear that chemical control on the maunga for weed control, pest control, is not wanted. So what do we do as a nation to provide the tools that we're going to get to? The korero yesterday, 2025, pest-free, 2050, sorry. So again, it's having those conversations with people to find out what the aspirations are, what will work, what won't, and where is the rub, but where is also the common agreement. So there was some whittle there that I said I'd answer. So any reflections from that? I promised John I wouldn't berate you with a PowerPoint. And I've got this if you want to reflect on that. Just, okay. So these are some of the things that have been happening in the biosecurity space. I think license to operate is a really important thing, and also timelines are not only important, but social license isn't, yes, the community wants or not wants glyphosate now, and one of the case in points is biological control, which this centre has been a leader in the research and and developing them for implementation. But we heard from Dan Coop that connectivity between my own personal mahi, which was biocontrol of Tradescantia, and Linley Hayes and Simon Fowler's team. Yes, there's knobbly, shiny and stripy, the Neolema beetles that have been released. But you heard Dan say this morning, well, where is it? The landowners with Tradescantia and the QE2 covenants don't have access to it. The regional councils and DOC funded that program at Manaki Whenua for those Brazilian beetles to be imported, yet still they are in the domain of a few labs here and there or someone's bedroom. So, so you've got to think about the research and its not only its where it gets to, but that implementation. And I think that was a really good point by Dan this morning to say we can do the best research in the world, but if it sits on a shelf in a paper, it's not really going to go anywhere in terms of creating some of that impact and reversing New Zealand's biological decline. And so a shout out to Marcus and Maipura, who are working in the centre at the moment to think about biocontrol for all that weedy problem in Auckland, Tamaki Makaurau, the weediest city on earth, and looking at, does the cultural licence still exist, or did it ever exist, with the 22 mana whenua of Tamaki Makaurau for Auckland Council's biocontrol of weeds program? And it's a real essential piece of the puzzle, which timelines are dynamic and often change. You don't have social licence forever. Community values shift. So that whole raru around the GMOs in New Zealand really hasn't there's been a little bit here and there, but it really hasn't been tested, I guess, and checked back in very well. So it's a bit ad hocery. And so doing the research that Marcus and Meikura are doing with mana whenua in Auckland, testing that even old tools in the toolbox like biocontrol, which has been, 40 years in New Zealand, 50 years in New Zealand for weed control, checking back in because social and cultural license isn't just something you get once. Okay, it's okay to do biocontrol forevermore. That's actually not how social license works. So even understanding that is really important. And values and priorities can change in that time. And certainly for Māori, we have a whole lot of changes since the first biocontrol of weeds organism was brought into the country. We have iwi settlements for a start, so all sorts have happened. Don't worry, I'm not going to give you that. We all know about that, don't we? And I think, remember all those slides that never used to say human health was part of the biosecurity system? Wow, that's changed, hasn't it? One of the things I said in that talk in 2017 was about, at the time, the Asian toadfly had arrived in Aotearoa in South Auckland, and of course Auckland was always in a sort of a semi-controlled area notice state with the Queensland fruit fly. But at the time, someone said, well, how would you engage the communities that are affected in the rohe or region where this Asian toadfly had arrived? And these are the South Auckland mana whenua ropu, iwi hapu, that have interests in that very area. So nothing's happened since I put that slide up, by the way. So if something again happens in Manurewa of a biosecurity incursion, we're no better off than we were when I presented that in 2017, which is why I talk about the peacetime. Making those engagements and collaborations and partnerships with community is really, really important to keep on and keep doing, because I pointed that out in 2017, and I would contend that the same issue does exist if something else arrived in that community, yet we still don't have that connection in the biosecurity space with those communities and those really key people in a biosecurity hotspot. So Maori biosecurity was something, that was the slide from 2017. And where I say things have progressed, things are optimistic, things are amazing, is Te Tara Whakamātaki, the Maori Biosecurity Network, and acknowledging the people that have brought that together. Namahi Amanda, who actually wrote the first, was a VMCF bid. So that was the first piece of funding towards it, and it's just bloomed and blossomed in a way that we could never have imagined. But it was a way that it was supposed to. The kaupapa was to get the word of biosecurity, the system, how it works, and who should be told about these issues like the PEP MV and who you would connect to. And so we're having our trustee hui next month, but this is a huge initiative which has contributed to the biosecurity system. And so it's I think, a positive thing to think about when we look back. There are things that have changed and things that have changed for the better. And there's all sorts of... Tame has been doing some great interviews on the Kim Hill show and other things. You can hear about what he's bringing in terms of biosecurity and pest control. So that's just an example. Now, diversity in the system is another thing I wanted to talk about, just quickly. And that's something in the science system, in any system. What's the diversity? Well, you have these statistics that Tara and co have tabulated together that are pretty grim, even though we have a so-called vision mātauranga, which is really a brown box sticking in the research sector. But it's not all bad, because there have been better scales around what does VM and the treasure and the taonga that Charles Royal gifted Aotearoa in New Zealand and MB. It's just not had any kaitiaki over, or any care or treasure or manaaki in the 17, 18 years it's been in our science system. But things are changing. The MB with the Science Challenge and other areas, Te Tara Whakamātaki and other Māori Ropu, pushing VM to actually move with the times as well. So there's, the words kaupapa Māori research didn't exist. Well, they did exist, but not in the MB speak. So that is where things are progressing in a positive way. And that inclusion of knowledge holders across the motu, it doesn't necessarily reside in an institute. In fact, what we heard this morning from people like Dan Coop, knowledge and ideas come from the flax roots or the grassroots or the landowners or communities. It's really important to, if you want implementation, if you want connection, if you want to speed up timelines, to have those relationships of your communities of interest, and including always mana whenua. And we've seen some great initiatives coming out of those connections. Some more pictures. Back to weeds. Connections in biosecurity is not just about the motu, not just about Aotearoa New Zealand. You've always got to be, and MPO does this really well. It's one of the best agencies across the globe that thinks about what's happening elsewhere and what's on the horizon. But it means you also have to work with your nearest and dearest very closely, like this shows with the Phragmidium violaceum rust. So we already had these proof of concepts of these rusts coming across as biosecurity incursions. But by having those strong relationships or whakawhanangatanga with our nearest neighbours like Australia, Pacific, then you need to know what they're doing. So if this was an illegal introduction, but that can impact on our biosecurity system. So having relationships that's not just within Aotearoa New Zealand, but it's also outward for these very reasons. And that, of course, includes our Pacific whananga, and acknowledging the hats off that the reason Bioprotection Aotearoa is happening from July 1 is the inclusion of Tangata Pacific. And that's a really significant and with its own mana work and mahi and research that is going to be happening in the centre as well. So that was one of the directives from the Minister, that Tangata Pacific as part of Bioprotection Aotearoa. So that is part of the kaupapa that working with Māori and working with Pacific and beyond is also an important establishment as part of the centre as well. But we've always had those connections with our whananga, and hats off to people like Mel and Amanda and Albie and Nick Roskridge particularly, and all the mahi that he's been doing for decades in the Pacific with some amazing researchers. And you hopefully have met some of our Pacific champions. Don't worry, you will do. And so that's also an important part of working in a diverse space in the biosecurity and science research system. Communities, we heard a lot about that this morning. There are lots of invested communities across the motu that are important. They can add to your surveillance and monitoring program. And let's not forget we are a diverse community. There's all sorts of ethnicities and people that have interest in the biosecurity space. There you go. So, kia ora. It's just a few messages.